Victoria aimed her military-grade pepper spray at the Queen's elite guardsman, certain it would bring him to his knees. But when the burning mist cleared, his titanium gaze made her realize she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Here's what happened. The crisp autumn morning at Windsor Castle was pierced by the sharp clicks of designer heels against ancient cobblestones. Victoria Blackwood, Global Director of Executive Relations at a Fortune 500 company, carved her way through the gathering tourists like an icebreaker through frozen waters. Her Burberry trench coat fluttered behind her like a battle flag, its camel color matching her meticulously highlighted hair that cost more than most people's monthly rent. At 42, Victoria had mastered the art of making others feel insignificant with just a glance. Her emerald eyes, enhanced by expensive contact lenses, scanned the castle grounds with the practiced disdain of someone who considered historical landmarks mere backdrops for her social media presence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The gold-plated name tag on her leather briefcase announced her self-proclaimed importance to anyone unfortunate enough to cross her path. Excuse me, she barked at a group of schoolchildren on a field trip, her voice carrying the sharp edge of countless customer service confrontations. The young teacher herding them quickly pulled her students aside, recognizing the approaching storm in Victoria's expression. Some of us have actual appointments to keep. This isn't a playground, it's a historical site. The teacher mumbled an apology, but Victoria had already pushed past, leaving behind a wake of whispered conversations and disapproving glances. The morning fog still clung to the castle towers, creating an almost mystical atmosphere that drew tourists from around the world. But to Victoria, the gathering crowds were merely obstacles in her carefully scheduled day. She checked her Swiss watch, a gift she demanded from her last executive position after threatening to expose their questionable hiring practices, and her perfectly lined lips twisted into a scowl. Her Instagram followers knew her as the corporate queen, a self-styled advocate for professional excellence, who regularly posted long rants about customer service failures and workplace accountability. Her latest video about getting a barista fired for making her vanilla latte with non-organic milk had gone viral in all the wrong ways. But Victoria saw the negative comments as proof that the world wasn't ready for her brand of leadership. The tourists parted before her like waves, parents instinctively pulling their children closer as she passed. Her Louboutin heel struck the ancient stones with military precision, each step a declaration of her perceived authority. A street photographer lowered his camera as she approached, years of experience teaching him to recognize when a shot wasn't worth the potential confrontation. A group of American tourists huddled closer together, their matching red baseball caps marking them as part of an organized tour group that quickly rerouted to avoid her path. "Absolutely ridiculous," she announced to no one in particular, her voice carrying that particular tone that had made junior executives cry in boardroom meetings. Do they expect everyone to just stand around in this weather like common tourists? Her manicured hand gestured dismissively at the historic castle, 5 centuries of royal history reduced to an inconvenient backdrop for her morning grievances. The Louis Vuitton handbag swinging from her arm contained enough luxury items to fund a small charity, including the military-grade pepper spray she'd illegally imported from her last trip to Singapore. The morning sun finally broke through the fog, illuminating the castle's ancient stones and casting long shadows across the courtyard. Victoria's shadow stretched before her like a portent of the chaos she was about to unleash. Her phone buzzed constantly with emails from subordinates, too afraid to make decisions without her approval, each notification feeding her sense of self-importance. Then she saw him, the Queen's Guard stationed near the Norman Gate. His ceremonial uniform was immaculate, each brass button catching the morning light, the bearskin cap adding to his already imposing height. The scarlet tunic seemed to glow in the early morning sun, medals of valor and service decorating his chest like badges of honor. But to Victoria, he represented something else entirely, another uniformed figure who hadn't yet learned to bend to her will. She paused, tilting her head like a predator assessing its prey. The guard's unwavering focus, staring straight ahead as centuries of tradition demanded, seemed to trigger something deep within her. The same twitch in her perfectly Botoxed forehead that appeared just before she demanded someone's termination began to show. A small vein pulsed at her temple, a warning sign her former employees had learned to fear. "Well," she muttered, adjusting her designer scarf with sharp, aggressive movements, "we'll see about this level of service, won't we?" Her perfectly manicured nails drummed against her handbag, inches away from the weapon she'd soon deploy. The crowd around her began to shift uneasily, seasoned tourists recognizing the telltale signs of an approaching confrontation. A retired military officer, visiting from Canada, noticed the changing atmosphere and moved closer, his decades of service having taught him to recognize brewing trouble. His campaign ribbon from Afghanistan glinted in the morning sun as he positioned himself within intervention distance while still maintaining a respectful space. Victoria Blackwood took her first step toward the guard, her heel striking the cobblestone like a judge's gavel. The sound echoed off the ancient walls, a countdown to confrontation. She had no idea that the next few minutes would not only shatter her carefully constructed world of privilege, but would also make her infamous across the globe. Victoria stalked toward the guard with practiced intimidation, her designer heels echoing through Windsor Castle's ancient courtyard like warning shots. Her body language spoke of boardroom battles and corporate takeovers, each step calculated to maximize the impact of her approaching presence. The morning sun caught her diamond-studded watch, sending prismatic warnings across the weathered stones. "Security personnel," she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone of forced politeness that had preceded countless HR complaints throughout her career. "I couldn't help but notice your rather intimidating presence is disturbing the other visitors." The guard remained motionless, as still as the centuries-old statues adorning the castle walls. Several tourists nearby exchanged knowing glances, their smartphones discreetly shifting to recording position. A Japanese tour group quietly adjusted their route, their guide's experienced eyes recognizing the signs of an approaching Western confrontation. The morning air grew thick with anticipation, the kind that preceded viral social media moments. Victoria's nostrils flared slightly, a telltale sign that her carefully maintained corporate composure was beginning to crack. Her fingers tightened around her imported leather handbag, knuckles whitening beneath her French manicure. The bag itself, worth more than 3 months' salary of most castle employees, swung like a pendulum counting down to inevitable confrontation. "I said," she repeated, raising her voice to a level that had made CEOs flinch in boardroom meetings, "your presence is disturbing the visitors. Don't pretend you can't hear me." She stepped directly into his line of sight, her 5 feet 8 inches frame, elevated by Christian Louboutin heels, attempting to match his towering presence. The guard's eyes remained fixed forward, looking through her as if she were nothing more than morning mist. His discipline was evident in every aspect of his bearing, from his perfectly polished boots to the precise angle of his ceremonial rifle. The medals on his chest caught the strengthening sunlight, each one telling silent stories of service and sacrifice that Victoria was too self-absorbed to read. "Do you have any idea who I am?" she demanded, pulling herself to her full height. "I'm Victoria Blackwood, Global Director of Executive Relations at Apex Worldwide. I oversee crisis management for a Fortune 500 company." She punctuated each title with a sharp gesture, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light like angry stars. A young couple nearby began filming discreetly, recognizing the makings of what would likely become tomorrow's viral sensation. Their teenage daughter whispered something about TikTok algorithms and content gold, but her parents quietly urged her to step back, sensing the situation was about to escalate beyond social media entertainment. "I've handled security personnel far more qualified than you," Victoria continued, her voice taking on that dangerous edge that had preceded numerous career-ending confrontations. "Your little ceremonial act might impress the tourists, but I've dealt with actual corporate security teams." Her laptop bag, emblazoned with her company's logo, swung menacingly close to the guard's immaculate uniform. The retired Canadian officer watched with growing concern, his military experience allowing him to read the subtle signs of escalating conflict. He noticed how Victoria's right hand kept dipping into her designer bag. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A movement that triggered warnings honed by years of battlefield experience. His own hand unconsciously moved to the phone in his pocket, muscle memory from countless conflict situations. "This is exactly what's wrong with traditional institutions," Victoria announced loudly, clearly playing to her imagined audience. Standing there in your costume, thinking silence equals authority, she pulled out her phone, its crystal-encrusted case glinting in the morning sun. "Let's see how your superiors react when this goes viral. I have over 50,000 Instagram followers, and they're very interested in workplace accountability." The guard maintained his post with unwavering discipline, his eyes fixed on that distant point that centuries of tradition demanded. But there was something in his bearing now. Not tension, not anger, but the quiet readiness of a soldier who recognized approaching danger. His ceremonial rifle, though perfectly positioned, seemed to take on a more serious presence in his disciplined grip. A family of American tourists quickly ushered their children away, the parents recognizing that what had started as an amusing photo opportunity was transforming into something more volatile. The castle grounds seemed to hold its breath, the very stones beneath their feet waiting to witness what would unfold next. "Last chance," Victoria declared, her voice dropping to that dangerous whisper that had preceded countless corporate scandals. "Either acknowledge my complaint and modify your behavior, or I'll be forced to take this to a level you're clearly not prepared for." Her hand disappeared into her designer bag again, this time lingering longer, fingers wrapping around something that made the retired officer take an instinctive step forward. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the courtyard, turning the scene into a stark tableau of impending confrontation. Victoria's shadow stretched behind her like a dark reminder of consequences about to unfold, while the guards remained steady and unwavering, anchored in centuries of tradition and discipline. The stage was set for a clash between corporate entitlement and military honor, and only one would emerge unscathed. The autumn breeze swept through Windsor Castle's courtyard, carrying centuries of history and the faint scent of Victoria's 500-pound perfume. Medieval stone walls towered above the gathering crowd, silent witnesses to countless confrontations throughout history, though perhaps none quite like what was about to unfold. The morning sun had finally burned through the fog, illuminating the scene in harsh clarity. Tour groups clustered at strategic distances, their guides switching between multiple languages to quietly explain why they were maintaining a safe perimeter. A Chinese family's young daughter tugged at her mother's sleeve, asking in Mandarin why the angry lady was talking to the still soldier. Her mother quietly hushed her, recognizing from years of international business travel the universal signs of approaching trouble. The castle's ancient clock tower struck 9, its deep, resonant tones adding a theatrical countdown to the unfolding drama. Each toll seemed to heighten the tension, like a heartbeat growing stronger before a crucial moment. Victoria's expensive heel tapped in counterpoint to the bells, her impatience manifesting in sharp staccato clicks against cobblestones that had endured centuries of history. Overhead, ravens circled the castle towers, their black shapes casting fleeting shadows across the courtyard. These famous birds, longtime residents of the castle grounds, seemed to sense the brewing confrontation below. Their occasional calls pierced the tense atmosphere like omens, adding to the theatrical nature of the scene. A group of British schoolchildren on a field trip pressed against the courtyard's edges, their usual chatter reduced to whispers as they watched the confrontation brewing. Their teacher, a former military nurse who had served in Iraq, quietly positioned herself between her students and the unfolding scene, her experienced eyes noting every subtle shift in the situation's dynamics. The guard stood unwavering at his post, his scarlet uniform a bright slash of color against the castle's weathered gray stones. Morning dew still clung to his polished boots, reflecting the strengthening sunlight like mirrors. His ceremonial rifle, held in textbook-perfect position, represented not just tradition but the very essence of military discipline. Victoria's designer outfit, chosen carefully for what she had planned as a day of Instagram-worthy castle tours, now seemed garishly out of place against the ancient stonework. Her Burberry trench coat fluttered in the strengthening breeze, its movement contrasting sharply with the guard's statue-like stillness. The Louis Vuitton bag hanging from her arm contained enough luxury items to fund a small charity, including the illegally imported pepper spray she'd acquired through questionable corporate connections. The retired Canadian officer, observing from nearby, noted how the morning light caught the guards' medals, campaign ribbons from Afghanistan, service medals from Iraq, and ceremonial honors that spoke of a military career far more substantial than Victoria's dismissive costume comment suggested. His own experience told him that the perfectly pressed uniform and parade ground stance concealed a combat-trained soldier whose discipline was about to be tested in an unexpected way. Tourist photographs clicked in rapid succession, their digital sensors capturing every moment of what was clearly building toward something unprecedented. A German photojournalist, visiting the castle for an unrelated story, recognized the telltale signs of an approaching newsworthy incident and began adjusting his camera settings accordingly. The morning air carried the subtle scents of the castle grounds: ancient stone, polished brass, the distant aroma of the castle kitchen's breakfast preparation, all mixed with Victoria's overwhelming perfume that seemed to announce her presence like an olfactory herald. The breeze rustled through the nearby trees, their leaves creating a gentle susurration that contrasted with the growing tension. Around the edges of the courtyard, castle staff began to take notice. A groundskeeper paused in his morning duties, his decades of experience allowing him to sense when something was about to disturb the castle's usual routines. A junior tour guide spoke quietly into her radio, alerting security that something might require their attention near the Norman Gate. The tourist crowd had unconsciously arranged itself in a semicircle, like an audience at an impromptu theater performance. Phones were raised at strategic angles, their owners somehow sensing they were about to capture something that would dominate social media for days to come. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient cobblestones, creating natural spotlight effects that seemed to highlight the two main characters in this unfolding drama. Victoria's shadow stretched before her like a dark prophecy, while the guards remained as steady as his stance, both silhouettes merging and separating on the weathered stones as she shifted her aggressive stance. The castle walls seemed to lean in, their ancient stones having witnessed centuries of human drama, but perhaps nothing quite like the collision of modern entitlement and timeless discipline that was about to unfold. The air grew thick with anticipation, that peculiar tension that precedes memorable moments in history. Even the usual London passenger jets, their flight paths crossing over the castle, seemed to hang longer in the sky, as if their pilots sensed something unprecedented was about to occur below. The stage was set, the audience was in place, and the next few moments would transform this historic courtyard into the backdrop for a viral confrontation that would echo far beyond Windsor's ancient walls. "I deal with security personnel across 4 continents," Victoria announced to the growing crowd, her voice carrying that particular edge that had ended countless corporate careers. "And I've never encountered such a blatant display of unprofessionalism." Her fingers drummed against her designer bag, inches away from the weapon that would soon shatter the morning calm. The guard remained motionless, his disciplined stance a stark contrast to Victoria's increasingly agitated movements. The morning sun caught his medals, each one telling silent stories of battlefield courage that Victoria was too self-absorbed to comprehend. His ceremonial rifle, held with parade ground precision, gleamed with the same unwavering dedication as its bearer. A group of American tourists whispered among themselves, their cameras capturing every moment of what was clearly building toward something unprecedented. "She's definitely going to end up on public freakout Reddit," a teenager murmured to his father, who quietly urged his family to maintain a safer distance. "Do you have any idea how many followers I have?" Victoria's voice rose another octave, her carefully maintained corporate facade beginning to crack. "One post from me can make or break a business. I've had CEOs apologizing within hours of my reviews going live." She pulled out her phone, its diamond-encrusted case catching the light like warning signals. The retired Canadian officer watched intently as Victoria's body language shifted from aggressive to threatening. His years of combat experience recognized the telltale signs of someone about to escalate a situation beyond return. He noticed how her right hand kept returning to her bag, each movement more deliberate than the last. "This is exactly what's wrong with traditional institutions," she declared, playing to her imagined audience. "Standing there in your costume thinking silence equals authority." Her words bounced off the ancient castle walls, each echo seeming to mock her growing frustration. "I've dealt with actual security teams, professionals who understand customer service, not tourist attractions playing soldier." The guard's eyes remained fixed forward, looking through Victoria as if she were nothing more than morning mist. His discipline was evident in every aspect of his bearing, from his perfectly polished boots to the precise angle of his ceremonial rifle. But there was something else now, a subtle tension that only fellow soldiers might recognize, the quiet readiness of someone who sensed approaching danger. A young couple nearby began filming discreetly, recognizing the makings of what would likely become tomorrow's viral sensation. Their teenage daughter whispered something about TikTok algorithms and content gold, but her parents quietly urged her to step back, sensing the situation was about to escalate beyond social media entertainment. "I oversee crisis management for a Fortune 500 company," Victoria continued, her voice taking on that dangerous edge that had preceded numerous career-ending confrontations. "Do you think your little ceremonial act impresses me?" Her laptop bag, emblazoned with her company's logo, swung menacingly close to the guard's immaculate uniform. The morning breeze carried the subtle scents of the castle grounds. Ancient stone, polished brass, the distant aroma of the castle kitchen's breakfast preparation, all mixed with Victoria's overwhelming perfume that seemed to announce her presence like an olfactory herald. The wind rustled through nearby trees, their leaves creating a gentle susurration that contrasted with the growing tension. "Last chance," Victoria declared, her voice dropping to that dangerous whisper that had preceded countless corporate scandals. "Either acknowledge my complaint and modify your behavior, or I'll be forced to take this to a level you're clearly not prepared for." Her hand disappeared into her designer bag again, this time lingering longer, fingers wrapping around something that made the retired officer take an instinctive step forward. The castle's ancient clock tower struck another hour, its deep, resonant tones adding a theatrical countdown to the unfolding drama. Each toll seemed to heighten the tension, like a heartbeat growing stronger before a crucial moment. Victoria's expensive heel tapped in counterpoint to the bells, her impatience manifesting in sharp staccato clicks against cobblestones that had endured centuries of history. Tourist photographs clicked in rapid succession, their digital sensors capturing every moment of what was clearly building toward something unprecedented. A German photojournalist, visiting the castle for an unrelated story, recognized the telltale signs of an approaching newsworthy incident and began adjusting his camera settings accordingly. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the courtyard, turning the scene into a stark tableau of impending confrontation. Victoria's shadow stretched behind her like a dark reminder of consequences about to unfold, while the guards remained steady and unwavering, anchored in centuries of tradition and discipline. The stage was set for a clash between corporate entitlement and military honor, and only one would emerge unscathed. Victoria's gaze locked onto the guard like a predatory bird selecting its prey. Her corporate training in identifying weakness seemed to falter against his unwavering discipline, and this only fueled her mounting frustration. The morning light caught her designer watch as she raised her hand to gesture emphatically, its diamond-studded face sending prismatic warnings across the ancient courtyard. "I've been watching you," she declared, her voice carrying that particular tone that made boardroom executives squirm. "The way you stand there, intimidating visitors with your presence, did they teach you that in guard school?" Her sarcasm dripped like acid on the centuries-old cobblestones, eroding her carefully cultivated image of professional superiority with each passing moment. The guard maintained his forward gaze, looking past her toward a point that held significance only to those who had worn the uniform. His ceremonial rifle remained perfectly positioned, each brass fitting catching the strengthening sunlight. The medals on his chest told stories of Afghanistan, Iraq, and countless other conflicts that Victoria's privileged world had only seen on news headlines. Several senior castle staff members had appeared at the periphery of the courtyard, their walkie-talkies quietly crackling with coded communications. They maintained a professional distance, years of experience having taught them that direct intervention too early could sometimes escalate situations unnecessarily. One of them, a gray-haired woman with 3 decades of service to the crown, discreetly began documenting the incident on her tablet. "Oh, so we're playing the silent treatment game?" Victoria's voice rose another octave, her carefully maintained corporate facade cracking further. "I've broken tougher men than you in quarterly review meetings." She circled him like a shark, her Louboutin heels striking the ancient stones with increasing aggression. Each step echoed off the castle walls, creating a percussion of entitlement that seemed to mock the solemnity of the historic setting. The retired Canadian officer noticed how her hand kept returning to her designer bag, each movement more deliberate than the last. His combat-trained instincts recognized the telltale signs of someone preparing to escalate a situation beyond verbal confrontation. He quietly moved closer, positioning himself at an angle that would allow quick intervention if needed, his own service medals catching the morning light. "Let me explain something to you," Victoria continued, her voice taking on that dangerous edge that had preceded numerous career-ending confrontations. "I've handled security personnel across 4 continents. Your little ceremonial act might impress the tourists, but I've dealt with actual professionals." Her laptop bag, emblazoned with her company's logo, swung dangerously close to the guard's immaculate uniform, threatening to mar its pristine appearance. A young British couple nearby exchanged worried glances, the husband discreetly positioning himself between the unfolding scene and his pregnant wife. Their afternoon plans of romantic castle photos had unexpectedly transformed into front-row seats to what was clearly building toward a viral confrontation. The wife's hand protectively cradled her belly as she whispered to her husband about finding a different viewing spot. Victoria pulled out her phone, its crystal-encrusted case catching the morning sun. "Let's document this, shall we? My 50,000 followers would love to see how the Queen's Guard treats female visitors." She began narrating to her phone's camera, her voice taking on that particular tone of forced victimhood that had garnered her social media following. The phone's expensive protective case glinted like a weapon in the strengthening sunlight. "Security personnel displaying aggressive stance and refusing to acknowledge visitor concerns," she dictated, each word dripping with manufactured outrage. "Continuing pattern of intimidation through silence and military posturing." The phone's camera lens caught the sunlight, sending a sharp reflection across the guard's impassive face, yet still failing to provoke even the slightest reaction. The castle ravens had gathered on nearby battlements, their usually raucous calls falling silent as they observed the unfolding drama below. These ancient birds, longtime residents of Windsor Castle, seemed to sense the approaching storm. Their black shapes cast moving shadows across the courtyard, adding to the theatrical tension of the scene. Local legend held that these ravens could sense trouble before it happened, and their unusual silence spoke volumes. A group of Japanese tourists whispered among themselves, their guide quietly translating the situation while maintaining a safe distance. The guide's experienced eyes recognized the universal signs of approaching trouble, having seen similar scenarios unfold at tourist sites across Europe. She discreetly began moving her group toward the castle's inner courtyard, her practiced smile never wavering as she redirected their attention to other historical features. "I'm giving you one last chance," Victoria declared, her voice dropping to that dangerous whisper that had preceded countless corporate scandals. "Either acknowledge my complaint and modify your behavior, or I'll be forced to take this to a level you're clearly not prepared for." Her manicured fingers wrapped around something in her designer bag, the movement causing the retired officer to take another step forward, his military training alerting him to imminent danger. The morning sun now cast harsh shadows across the courtyard, turning the scene into a stark tableau of impending confrontation. Victoria's shadow stretched behind her like a dark reminder of consequences about to unfold, while the guards remained steady and unwavering, anchored in centuries of tradition and discipline. The stage was set for a clash between corporate entitlement and military honor, and only one would emerge unscathed from this unexpected battle on the hallowed grounds of Windsor Castle. "Excuse me, soldier," Victoria's voice cut through the morning air with practiced condescension. When a global director addresses you, basic courtesy dictates a response. She planted herself directly in front of the guard, her designer heels bringing her eye level with his chest medals. The morning sun caught her diamond earrings, sending hostile flashes across the ancient courtyard. The guard's stillness seemed to mock her authority, his disciplined stance a silent rebuke to her escalating aggression. His eyes remained fixed on that distant point, looking through her as if she were nothing more than castle mist. The ceremonial rifle in his hands, though decorative, carried the weight of centuries of military tradition. "I said," she repeated, her voice rising to that particular pitch that had made junior executives tremble. "When someone of my position speaks to you, you acknowledge them." Her French manicured hand gestured sharply, the motion sending her collection of designer bracelets jingling like warning bells. A small crowd had gathered at a safe distance, their phones raised like a forest of electronic witnesses. An American tourist whispered to his wife, "This is going straight to public freakout," while their teenage daughter already had her TikTok app open, recognizing prime viral content in the making. Victoria's nostrils flared as her carefully constructed corporate composure began to crack. The vein in her temple, usually hidden beneath expertly applied foundation, began to pulse visibly. Her fingers drummed against her imported leather handbag, inches from the illegal pepper spray she'd brought back from her last Singapore business trip. 20 years in corporate leadership, she announced to the growing audience, her voice carrying that edge of forced calm that preceded workplace storms. "I've managed security teams across 3 continents, and never, in all my experience, have I encountered such blatant disrespect." The guard remained motionless, his bearing perfect, each brass button on his uniform reflecting Victoria's increasingly agitated movements. His campaign medals told silent stories of real battles fought in distant lands, stories that made this courtyard confrontation seem trivial by comparison. "Oh, so this is how you handle customer relations?" Victoria's voice dripped with sarcasm. "Standing there in your costume, playing toy soldier while visitors try to engage professionally?" Her designer bag swung dangerously close to his ceremonial rifle, the leather nearly brushing against polished brass. The retired Canadian officer watched intently, his own military experience allowing him to read the subtle signs of escalating conflict. He noticed how Victoria's right hand kept returning to her bag, each movement more deliberate than the last. His combat-trained instincts recognized the telltale signs of someone preparing to escalate beyond verbal confrontation. "Let me explain something to you," Victoria continued, her voice taking on that dangerous edge that had preceded numerous career-ending confrontations. "I oversee crisis management for a Fortune 500 company. Your little ceremonial act might impress the tourists, but I've dealt with actual security professionals." The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the courtyard, turning the scene into a stark tableau of impending confrontation. Victoria's shadow stretched behind her like a dark prophecy, while the guards remained steady and unwavering, anchored in centuries of tradition and discipline. "I have over 50,000 Instagram followers," she declared, pulling out her phone with practiced flourish. "One post from me can make or break careers. Shall we see how your superiors react when this goes viral?" The crystal case of her phone caught the sunlight, sending sharp reflections across the guard's impassive face. Castle staff had begun to gather discreetly at the periphery, their walkie-talkies crackling with quiet urgency. A senior guide, recognizing the signs of impending trouble, began quietly redirecting other tour groups away from the scene. The ravens overhead had fallen unusually silent, their black shapes casting shifting shadows across the ancient stones. "This is your final warning," Victoria announced, her voice carrying that particular tone that had preceded countless HR complaints. "Either acknowledge my presence and modify your behavior, or I'll be forced to escalate this situation beyond your pay grade." The guard's eyes remained forward, his training evident in every line of his bearing. But there was something else now. Not tension, not anger, but the quiet readiness of a soldier who recognized approaching danger. His ceremonial rifle, though perfectly positioned, seemed to take on a more serious presence in his disciplined grip. A Japanese tour group quietly retreated, their guide recognizing the universal language of approaching confrontation. British schoolchildren on a field trip were quickly shepherded away by their teachers, though their phones remained raised, capturing every moment of what was clearly building toward something unprecedented. The morning air had grown thick with tension, the kind that preceded viral moments and career-ending decisions. Victoria's expensive perfume mixed with the ancient stone's dampness, creating an atmosphere as charged as any boardroom before a hostile takeover. "Time's up, soldier boy," she hissed, her voice dropping to that dangerous whisper that had preceded countless corporate casualties. Her hand disappeared into her designer bag again, fingers wrapping around the metal canister that would soon shatter the morning calm. "Let's see how well you maintain that superior attitude after this." Victoria's composure cracked like expensive porcelain as her assault on the guard's discipline entered its next phase. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across Windsor Castle's ancient courtyard, as if nature itself was eliminating any place to hide from what was about to unfold. "Still playing statue, are we?" she snarled, her corporate mask slipping to reveal something darker beneath. Her Louboutin heels struck the cobblestones with increasing force as she circled the guard, each step echoing off the castle walls like ammunition being loaded. "Let me show you how we handle difficult employees in the private sector." The guard maintained his forward gaze, but there was a subtle shift in his bearing now. Not fear, not anger, but the quiet readiness of a soldier who sensed approaching danger. His ceremonial rifle, though perfectly positioned, seemed to take on a more serious presence in his disciplined grip. Years of battlefield experience had taught him to recognize the signs of imminent attack. The crowd had grown larger, but more distant, creating an invisible ring of tension around the unfolding drama. Phones were raised at every angle, their owners somehow sensing they were about to capture something unprecedented. A BBC journalist who happened to be visiting the castle for an unrelated story had begun filming with professional equipment. "I've dealt with security personnel far more qualified than you," Victoria continued, her voice taking on that dangerous edge that had preceded numerous career-ending confrontations. "Your little ceremonial act might impress the tourists, but I've managed teams across 4 continents." Her designer bag swung dangerously close to his immaculate uniform, the leather nearly brushing against his medals. The retired Canadian officer had positioned himself strategically closer, his combat experience allowing him to read the escalating situation. He noticed how Victoria's right hand kept disappearing into her bag, each movement more deliberate than the last. His own hand moved to his phone, muscle memory from countless conflict situations taking over. 20 years in corporate leadership, she announced to the growing audience, her voice carrying that edge of forced calm that preceded workplace storms. "I've broken stronger men than you in quarterly review meetings." Her perfectly manicured nails drummed against her handbag, inches from the weapon she'd soon deploy. A group of American tourists whispered among themselves, their cameras capturing every moment. "She's definitely going to end up on World Star," a teenager murmured to his father, who quietly urged his family to maintain a safer distance. The castle ravens circled overhead, their unusual behavior adding to the mounting tension. Victoria pulled out her phone again, its crystal case catching the sunlight like a warning signal. "Let's document this properly," she declared, her voice taking on that particular tone of manufactured victimhood that had garnered her social media following. "My 50,000 followers would love to see how the Queen's Guard treats female executives." The guard's eyes remained fixed forward, looking through her as if she were nothing more than morning mist. But there was something in his bearing now, a subtle tension that only fellow soldiers might recognize. The quiet readiness of someone who had faced real threats in combat zones far from this tourist-filled courtyard. Security personnel displaying aggressive stance, she narrated to her phone's camera, each word dripping with calculated outrage. Continuing pattern of intimidation through silence and military posturing. The phone's lens caught the sunlight, sending sharp reflections across the guard's impassive face. Castle staff had begun to gather at strategic points around the courtyard, their walkie-talkies crackling with urgent but hushed communications. A senior guide, recognizing the signs of impending trouble, began quietly redirecting other tour groups away from the scene. The morning air grew thick with anticipation. "Last warning," Victoria declared, her voice dropping to that dangerous whisper that had preceded countless corporate scandals. "Either acknowledge my complaint and modify your behavior, or I'll be forced to take this to a level you're clearly not prepared for." Her manicured fingers wrapped around something in her designer bag, the movement causing the retired officer to take another step forward. The sun cast harsh shadows across the courtyard, turning the scene into a stark tableau of impending confrontation. Victoria's shadow stretched behind her like a dark reminder of consequences about to unfold, while the guards remained steady and unwavering, anchored in centuries of tradition and discipline. Time seemed to slow as Victoria's hand emerged from her bag, the small metal canister catching the morning light like a deadly jewel. The retired officer's eyes widened in recognition, his combat experience screaming warnings about what was about to unfold. But before he could intervene, Victoria had already raised the pepper spray, her finger tightening on the trigger with the same decisiveness she used to sign termination notices. The retired Canadian officer's combat instincts screamed danger as he watched Victoria's body language shift from aggressive to predatory. His years of military service in global hotspots had taught him to recognize the telltale signs of imminent violence. Each movement of her designer bag, each dip of her manicured hand inside it, sent warning signals through his battle-hardened senses. "Come on, soldier boy," Victoria taunted, her corporate veneer cracking to reveal something more volatile beneath. "Let's see how well your little parade ground routine holds up under real pressure." Her heels clicked against the ancient cobblestones with increasing aggression, each step marking another tick toward inevitable confrontation. The veteran began moving closer, his practiced eyes noting every detail. The guard's bearing remained perfect, but there was a subtle tension in his jaw now, the kind that came from years of real combat experience recognizing genuine threat. The ceremonial rifle, though perfectly positioned, seemed to take on a more serious presence in his disciplined grip. "I'm about to show you how we handle difficult situations in the corporate world," Victoria announced, her voice carrying that dangerous edge that had preceded numerous career-ending confrontations. Her fingers kept returning to her bag, each movement more deliberate than the last, brushing against the metal canister hidden within. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard as more castle staff appeared at the periphery. The veteran noticed how they positioned themselves strategically, their walkie-talkies crackling with quiet urgency. His own service in peacekeeping missions had taught him how quickly seemingly controlled situations could spiral into chaos. "Still maintaining that superior attitude?" Victoria's voice dripped with venom as she circled the guard. "Let's see how well that works when I'm done here." Her designer bag swung like a pendulum, counting down the moments before her planned assault. The veteran's hand instinctively moved toward his phone, muscle memory from countless conflict situations taking over. A group of Japanese tourists whispered among themselves, their guide quietly translating the situation while maintaining a safe distance. The veteran recognized the universal signs of approaching trouble, having seen similar scenarios unfold in conflict zones across the globe. His campaign medals clinked softly as he shifted position, ready to intervene. Victoria pulled out her phone, its crystal case catching the sunlight like a warning signal. "Let's make sure everyone sees this," she declared, her voice taking on that particular tone of manufactured victimhood that had garnered her social media following. "My followers will love to see how the Queen's Guard handles professional women." The guard's eyes remained forward, but the veteran noticed the subtle signs of combat readiness in his stance. Having served in Afghanistan himself, he recognized the quiet alertness of a soldier who sensed approaching danger. The morning light caught both their metals, creating a silent dialogue of shared military experience across the courtyard. "Security personnel displaying aggressive behavior," Victoria narrated to her phone's camera, each word dripping with calculated outrage. "Continuing pattern of intimidation through military posturing." The phone's lens caught the sunlight, sending sharp reflections across the guard's impassive face. The veteran moved closer still, positioning himself at an angle that would allow quick intervention if needed. His own experience in hostile situations told him this was building toward something unprecedented. The weight of his service pistol, though long absent from his hip, seemed to ghost there as muscle memory kicked in. Castle staff had begun to gather at strategic points around the courtyard, their walkie-talkies crackling with urgent but hushed communications. The veteran noted their positioning, appreciating their professional distance while maintaining readiness to respond. The morning air grew thick with anticipation. "Final warning," Victoria declared, her voice dropping to that dangerous whisper that had preceded countless corporate scandals. "Either acknowledge my complaint and modify your behavior, or I'll show you what real power looks like." Her manicured fingers wrapped around something in her designer bag, the movement causing the veteran to take another step forward. The sun cast harsh shadows across the courtyard, turning the scene into a stark tableau of impending confrontation. Victoria's shadow stretched behind her like a dark reminder of consequences about to unfold, while the guards remained steady and unwavering, anchored in centuries of tradition and discipline. The veteran's combat-trained eyes caught the metallic glint within Victoria's bag. Years of battlefield experience had taught him to recognize weapons of all kinds, even those disguised as civilian accessories. His mind rapidly calculated intervention angles, crowd positions, and potential collateral risks, just as he had done countless times in combat zones. A small child's voice pierced the tension. "Mummy, why is that angry lady going to hurt the soldier?" The innocent question carried clearly in the tense atmosphere, causing Victoria's face to flush with even deeper rage. The veteran noticed how her grip tightened on her bag, knuckles whitening beneath her expensive manicure. Time seemed to slow as Victoria's hand moved toward her bag one final time, the morning light catching her diamond rings like warning flares. The veteran was already in motion, his decades of military training driving him to prevent what he knew was about to unfold. But before he could close the distance, Victoria had already raised the pepper spray, her finger tightening on the trigger with practiced corporate efficiency. "Time's up, soldier boy," Victoria snarled, her corporate mask completely shattered. The morning sun caught the metal canister in her hand as she raised it to chest level, its industrial-grade warning label clearly visible to the horrified onlookers. "Let's see how well your military discipline holds up against this." The retired Canadian officer broke into a controlled sprint, his combat instincts screaming at the sight of the military-grade pepper spray. His service medals clinked against his chest as he moved, each step carrying the urgency of someone who had seen similar weapons deployed in actual combat zones. "Ma'am, stand down!" he called out, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of battlefield command. The guard maintained his forward gaze, but there was a subtle shift in his bearing now. Not fear, not anger, but the quiet readiness of a soldier who had faced worse threats in distant war zones. His ceremonial rifle, though perfectly positioned, seemed to take on a more serious presence in his disciplined grip. Years of real combat experience had taught him to recognize the signs of imminent attack. "Don't you dare try to stop me," Victoria spat at the approaching veteran, her designer bag swinging wildly as she turned to face him. "I've dealt with plenty of men who thought their military background made them untouchable." Her French manicured fingers tightened around the pepper spray canister, its safety cap already removed and discarded on the ancient cobblestones. Castle security personnel had begun converging on the scene, their practiced movements suggesting years of training in handling volatile situations. But they maintained a cautious distance, recognizing that direct intervention might trigger the very confrontation they hoped to prevent. Their radios crackled with urgent communications, codes passing between them in hushed tones. "That's military-grade pepper spray," the veteran announced to the gathering security team, his experienced eyes recognizing the distinctive markings on the canister. "Same type we used in crowd control operations overseas." His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen firsthand the damage such weapons could inflict. Victoria's lips curved into a predatory smile, her expensive lipstick catching the morning light like fresh blood. "Oh, so you recognize this?" she purred, her corporate training twisting into something more sinister. "Then you know exactly what it can do to those pretty eyes of his." She gestured toward the guard with the canister, its nozzle now aimed directly at his unwavering gaze. The crowd had grown larger but more distant, creating an invisible ring of tension around the unfolding drama. Phones were raised at every angle, their owners somehow sensing they were about to capture something unprecedented. A BBC journalist who happened to be visiting the castle had begun filming with professional equipment, his experienced eye recognizing the makings of a viral news story. "Ma'am, that weapon is illegal in the UK," the veteran stated firmly, his stance widening into a defensive position. "Lower it now, before you make a mistake you can't undo." His own combat experience in urban warfare had taught him the devastating effects of chemical weapons, even those marketed as non-lethal. "Mistake?" Victoria laughed, the sound echoing off the castle walls like broken glass. "The only mistake was his decision to ignore me." She raised her phone with her free hand, its camera already recording. "My followers are about to see what happens when the Queen's Guard meets corporate authority." The morning sun had reached its zenith, eliminating all shadows from the courtyard and illuminating the scene with harsh clarity. The guards' medals gleamed under the direct light, each one telling silent stories of service and sacrifice that Victoria was too blinded by rage to read. His eyes remained forward, focused on that distant point that protocol demanded, but his combat experience screamed warnings about the imminent chemical attack. "Last chance, soldier," Victoria declared, her voice dropping to that dangerous whisper that had preceded countless corporate casualties. "Either acknowledge my presence and apologize, or I'll show you exactly how we handle difficult personnel in the private sector." The pepper spray canister caught the sunlight, its industrial-grade warning label clearly visible to the horrified onlookers. The veteran had positioned himself strategically now, ready to intervene, but knowing he might not be fast enough to prevent what was about to unfold. His years of military service had taught him the cruel mathematics of combat. Sometimes you couldn't stop the first strike, you could only manage its aftermath. Castle ravens circled overhead, their unusual behavior adding to the mounting tension. Their black shapes cast fleeting shadows across the courtyard, like nature's own warning signals of approaching chaos. The morning air had grown thick with anticipation, the kind that preceded moments of infamy destined for viral immortality. Time seemed to slow as Victoria's finger tightened on the trigger, the small metal canister aimed directly at the guard's unprotected face. The veteran was already moving, his decades of military training driving him to prevent what he knew was about to unfold. But before he could close the distance, Victoria had already begun her assault, her corporate efficiency turned toward a far more sinister purpose. Time shattered like crystal as Victoria unleashed the military-grade pepper spray directly at the guard's face. The morning sun caught the caustic mist, turning it into a deadly amber cloud that seemed to hang in the air for an eternal moment. Her aim was precise. Corporate efficiency turned to malicious purpose as she emptied the entire canister toward his unprotected eyes. "Let's see how well you maintain that superior attitude now," she snarled, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone who believed they were delivering righteous justice. The expensive canister gleamed in her manicured hands like a perverse trophy as she continued her assault. The retired Canadian officer froze mid-stride, his combat experience telling him he was too late to prevent the attack. His weathered face showed the grim recognition of someone who had seen similar weapons deployed in actual combat zones. But what happened next left even his battle-hardened senses struggling to comprehend. The guard didn't move. His eyes remained open, unflinching as the chemical assault battered against them. Not a muscle twitched, not a step faltered. The caustic spray ran down his face like tears, but his expression remained as immovable as the castle walls behind him. Years of military training, of real combat experience, of standing firm in the face of genuine threats, culminated in this moment of extraordinary discipline. Victoria's triumphant expression faltered, then crumbled into confusion, as she realized her attack had failed to produce the expected response. The empty canister slipped from her fingers, clattering against the cobblestones with an accusatory ring that echoed through the suddenly silent courtyard. "That's impossible," she whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. "You should be—" She took a stumbling step backward, her designer heels catching on the uneven ground. "Why aren't you—" Her carefully constructed world of corporate power began to crumble around her. The guard's face was wet with the chemical spray, his eyes undoubtedly burning with an intensity few civilians could comprehend, but his posture remained perfect, his gaze steady, his discipline unbroken. Small rivulets of the caustic liquid traced paths down his scarlet tunic, staining the immaculate uniform but failing to stain the dignity it represented. The veteran finally reached them, his campaign medals jingling with the momentum of his approach. "Dear God," he breathed, taking in the scene with the experienced eye of someone who had seen combat in 3 decades of service. "In 30 years of military service, I've never—" The crowd had gone absolutely silent. Even the ever-present London traffic seemed muted, as if the city itself was holding its breath. The morning sun highlighted every detail of the scene, the guard's unwavering stance, the spreading stains on his uniform, Victoria's rapidly paling face as the magnitude of her actions began to sink in. "You just assaulted a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces," the veteran stated, his voice carrying the weight of military authority. He reached into his jacket, producing a water bottle and a clean handkerchief. "Son, at least let me help you clear your eyes." Victoria's legs seemed to give way, and she sank onto a nearby bench, her designer bag falling forgotten at her feet. The reality of what she'd done was finally breaking through her wall of entitlement. I was just—" But before she could finish, something changed in the air. The guard, who had remained motionless through the entire assault, slowly turned his head. His eyes, though undoubtedly burning with unimaginable pain, fixed directly on Victoria with a gaze that carried the weight of every soldier who had ever stood firm in the face of adversity. When he spoke, his voice was steady, controlled, and carried the kind of authority that could only be earned through real service and sacrifice, the kind of authority that made Victoria's earlier claims of power seem like a child playing dress-up in comparison. "Hold still, son," the veteran said softly, his weathered hands steady as he raised the water bottle. "I've seen my share of CS gas in training. This isn't much different." He spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had been through worse, much worse. His movements were precise, efficient, the kind of care that came from years of treating battlefield injuries. The water ran clear over the guard's face, carrying away the worst of the chemical assault. The white handkerchief, carefully folded into a precise square, dabbed at the guard's eyes with paternal gentleness. The gathered crowd watched in stunned silence as this moment of military brotherhood unfolded before them. Police sirens could be heard in the distance, growing closer with each passing moment. Victoria remained frozen on the bench, her earlier bravado completely evaporated. The pepper spray canister lay where it had fallen, a silent testament to her monumental miscalculation. The guard's eyes, though reddened from the attack, remained focused and clear, a testament to the kind of training and discipline that no amount of corporate power could ever hope to match. The morning sun continued its climb, casting its unforgiving light on a scene that would soon become viral history. 22 years in the Royal Marines, the veteran announced, his voice carrying just far enough for Victoria to hear every word. Served in the Falklands, Iraq, Northern Ireland. His weathered hands continued their careful work, cleaning the chemical residue from the guard's face with practiced efficiency. But what this young man just did, that's the kind of discipline they write about in training manuals. Victoria remained frozen on her bench, her 5,000-pound designer outfit suddenly seeming as inappropriate as a carnival costume at a funeral. The pepper spray canister lay where it had fallen, its military-grade warning label clearly visible to the gathering police officers who had just arrived at the scene. "You see these medals?" The veteran gestured to the guard's chest with his free hand, his voice carrying decades of military pride. "They're not decorative. Each one tells a story of service, sacrifice, and the kind of courage you clearly don't understand." The morning sun caught the brass decorations, making them shine with renewed dignity, despite the chemical stains on the scarlet tunic. 2 senior police officers approached, their steps measured and professional. They'd been briefed on the situation during their approach, and their faces showed the particular expression of law enforcement officials who knew they were dealing with an incident that would generate paperwork for weeks to come. "I was there, you know," the veteran continued, carefully wiping the last traces of spray from the guard's face. "When they train these men, It's not just about standing still and looking impressive for tourists. Every guard you see here is a combat-qualified soldier. They've faced real threats, real danger, not just entitled civilians with illegal weapons. The police officers reached Victoria's bench, their shadows falling across her expensive shoes. "Ma'am," the senior officer began, his tone professional but firm, "we need you to come with us." His partner was already collecting the discarded pepper spray canister, carefully handling it as evidence. Victoria's hands trembled in her lap as the veteran's words continued to cut through her remaining defenses. The crowd had drawn closer again, but now their faces showed a mixture of awe for the guard's composure and undisguised contempt for her actions. Several phones remained raised, documenting every moment of her humiliation for social media posterity. "There you are, son," the veteran said, stepping back to inspect his work. "Not quite regulation shine on those buttons anymore, but under the circumstances." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I think even Her Majesty would understand." The water bottle and handkerchief had done their job, though the guard's eyes remained noticeably reddened from the attack. The police officer helping Victoria to her feet noticed her designer bag. "We'll need to check that as well, ma'am," he stated firmly. "Military-grade pepper spray is a prohibited weapon in the United Kingdom. We need to ensure you're not carrying any other illegal items." Victoria's face, usually masked by expensive makeup and practiced corporate confidence, had taken on the pallid look of someone seeing their carefully constructed world crumbling around them. Her phone, still clutched in her trembling hand, continued to record, capturing her own downfall instead of the victory she'd planned to post. The guard remained at attention, his bearing perfect despite the assault he'd endured. Something passed between him and the veteran, an unspoken understanding that only those who had worn the uniform could truly comprehend. The veteran straightened, delivering a crisp salute that spoke volumes about the respect he held for the younger soldier's display of discipline. "The chemical weapon you used," one officer explained while his partner began the formal arrest procedure, "is classified as a Section 5 firearm under UK law. The penalties for possession and use are quite severe." His voice carried that particular tone of law enforcement officials who know they're dealing with someone unused to facing real consequences. The veteran turned to face Victoria, his voice taking on an edge of steel. "Now then," he fixed her with the kind of stare that had once commanded men in battle, "I believe this young man has earned the right to speak. And madam," his eyes narrowed slightly, "I suggest you listen very carefully to what he has to say." The morning sun had reached its zenith, casting no shadows as Victoria faced the consequences of her actions. The castle walls seemed to lean in, centuries of history waiting to witness justice being served on their ancient grounds. The guard's eyes, though still reddened from the attack, held steady as he prepared to address his attacker. Police radios crackled with coded communications as more officers arrived to manage the growing crowd. The castle staff had begun their own damage control procedures, senior guides expertly redirecting tour groups while maintaining the dignity of the historic site. The ravens overhead had resumed their posts, as if sensing that order was about to be restored to their domain. "In Afghanistan," the guard's voice rang out with parade ground authority, each word precise despite the lingering burn of the pepper spray. "I once held position under heavy fire for 6 hours to protect wounded civilians." His eyes, still reddened but unflinching, locked onto Victoria with sniper focus. "Your pepper spray, madam, doesn't quite compare to Taliban artillery." Victoria seemed to shrink further into herself with each word, her expensive blazer offering no protection against the weight of his quiet authority. The police officers paused in their evidence collection, recognizing that this moment deserved their respectful attention. "This uniform," he gestured to his stained tunic, his voice carrying the kind of command that came from real battlefield experience, "has been worn in every major conflict for centuries. The men who wore it before me didn't just stand guard at a palace. They fought at Waterloo, stormed the beaches at Normandy, held the line in Korea. Each word landed like artillery fire, precision guided by years of genuine service. The crowd had drawn closer, pulled in by the power of the guard's words and the underlying steel in his voice. Even the castle ravens seemed to pause their eternal patrol, perching on nearby battlements to witness this moment of reckoning. Let me educate you about what you really attacked today. The guard's voice took on an edge that could have cut diamond. This isn't just a uniform. It's a symbol of every sacrifice made to ensure people like you can walk freely through these gates. These medals, he touched his chest, they're not decorative. Each one was earned in combat zones you couldn't find on a map. Sarah's face had lost all color, her earlier righteous indignation replaced by growing horror as the reality of her actions sank in. The police officers exchanged glances, their handcuffs temporarily forgotten as they too were caught in the gravity of the moment. You accused me of staring, of harassment, of intimidation. His voice carried a cold fury now, controlled but unmistakable. Would you like to know what I was actually looking at? That fixed point we're trained to maintain? It's a memorial to fallen comrades who gave their lives so entitled civilians could have the freedom to make spectacularly poor decisions. The veteran nodded slowly, his own medals catching the midday sunlight. His face showed grim approval as the guard continued, each word carrying the weight of centuries of military tradition. Your pepper spray burned, madam. I won't deny that. His composure remained absolute, making his next words even more powerful. But I've carried wounded men through firefights. I've felt real pain, the kind that comes from putting others before yourself. That's what this uniform teaches us. That's what you failed to understand. Victoria's lips trembled as she tried to form words, but the guard wasn't finished. His voice dropped lower, somehow becoming even more commanding. I pity you. The words fell like hammer blows. I pity anyone who sees a soldier standing guard and thinks victim, who mistakes discipline for weakness, who believes their personal grievances outweigh centuries of duty and sacrifice. Tears were streaming down Victoria's face now, but they weren't the manipulative tears she'd used to get her way in countless customer service confrontations. These were real, the kind that came from finally facing the magnitude of one's own actions. The Queen's Guard isn't just a tourist attraction, madam. His voice carried the full weight of military authority now. We are combat soldiers who choose to serve ceremonially while maintaining operational readiness. That pepper spray, he gestured to the canister now sealed in a police evidence bag. We train with worse. The chemical burns you just inflicted? They're nothing compared to what we endure to earn this uniform. The silence in the courtyard was absolute as he delivered his final words. You came here looking for attention, trying to prove some point about power and authority. Instead, you've demonstrated exactly why we stand guard, to protect a society that allows even people like you to enjoy freedoms you clearly don't appreciate. Victoria was openly sobbing now, her carefully applied makeup running in dark streaks down her face. The guard's words had stripped away every layer of her entitled armor, leaving her exposed to the harsh reality of her own behavior. The police will handle things from here, he concluded, his voice carrying a note of finality. I suggest you use these last few moments of freedom to reflect on the difference between real strength and the kind you tried to demonstrate today. The veteran's face showed quiet pride as the guard resumed his forward gaze, discipline unbroken despite everything that had transpired. The morning sun painted the scene in unforgiving clarity, a moment of true authority triumphing over artificial power, of substance defeating style, of duty prevailing over entitlement. Soon after, police officers led Victoria Blackwood away, her designer bag confiscated as evidence. The sharp clicks of her Louboutin heels, once commanding attention, now marked the retreating steps of someone who had finally learned the true meaning of authority. Each step along the ancient cobblestones seemed to echo her downfall. 25 years on the force, the senior police officer remarked, sealing the military-grade pepper spray in an evidence bag. And I've never seen anything quite like this. He shook his head, adding the canister to a growing collection of evidence that would soon document Victoria's spectacular fall from corporate grace. The veteran stood quietly nearby, his weathered face showing the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed justice properly served. He gathered his empty water bottle and damp handkerchief, offering one final salute to the guard before melting back into the crowd. His own service medals caught the midday sun as he departed, a silent reminder of the brotherhood of those who serve. Castle staff had begun their practiced damage control procedures, senior guides expertly redirecting tour groups while maintaining the dignity of the historic site. But many visitors lingered, their phones still raised, capturing every moment of what they knew would become a viral sensation. The footage was already spreading across social media platforms, hashtags multiplying like digital wildfire. "Her company's going to love this," an American tourist whispered to his wife, already scrolling through Twitter where clips of the incident were gathering thousands of retweets. Global Director of Executive Relations attacks Queen's Guard. "You can't make this stuff up." His teenage daughter was already crafting a TikTok video that would soon gather millions of views. Victoria's carefully curated social media presence was transforming in real time. Her 50,000 Instagram followers were witnessing a very different kind of content than her usual corporate power poses and luxury lifestyle shots. The comment sections of her previous posts were flooding with references to the incident, her carefully constructed digital empire crumbling as fast as her real-world authority. The guard's uniform, though bearing the evidence of Victoria's assault, seemed to gleam with renewed dignity in the midday light. Each water stain and chemical mark told its own story of unwavering discipline in the face of ignorance. His eyes, still reddened but resolute, resumed their vigil over the palace grounds. Police radios crackled with updates as Victoria was escorted to a waiting patrol car. "Subject in custody, evidence secured," one officer reported. Multiple witness statements and video evidence collected. The formal machinery of justice was already in motion, its gears grinding with particular efficiency when dealing with attacks on military personnel. A senior castle administrator, her badge indicating decades of service to the crown, approached the scene with practiced diplomacy. "The palace will be pressing charges," she informed the police officers, her tone carrying the weight of centuries of institutional authority. "Her Majesty's government takes attacks on military personnel very seriously." Victoria's corporate ID badge, still hanging from her designer blazer, caught the light as she was helped into the police car. The title, Global Director of Executive Relations, seemed almost satirical now, a reminder of how quickly artificial authority can crumble when confronted with genuine strength of character. News vans had begun arriving at the castle gates, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like mechanical flowers seeking sensation instead of sun. Reporters checked their microphones and smoothed their jackets, preparing to broadcast this story of entitlement meeting its match in military discipline. The veteran, before completely disappearing into the crowd, passed a card to one of the police officers. "Combat stress counseling," he explained quietly. "The young man won't ask for it, but even the strongest need support sometimes." The officer nodded, understanding the wisdom earned through decades of military service. Castle ravens returned to their usual posts, their harsh calls seeming to mock the departed Victoria. These ancient birds, longtime residents of the castle grounds, had witnessed centuries of human drama, but even they seemed impressed by the morning's display of discipline over disorder. Social media channels were already exploding with hashtags, "Chuck's Queen's Guard Strong," "Chuck's Corporate Karen," "Chuck's Windsor Justice." Video clips of the incident were being shared across platforms, each one capturing a different angle of Victoria's monumental miscalculation and the guard's extraordinary response. The chemical smell of the pepper spray had begun to dissipate in the autumn breeze, but its effects would linger far longer than Victoria had anticipated. Her career, her carefully cultivated image, her social media influence, all were now tainted by those few moments of spectacular misjudgment. As the police car pulled away from the castle grounds, the guard maintained his unwavering vigilance. His posture remained perfect, his discipline unbroken, though the evidence of the morning's confrontation still marked his uniform. Each stain seemed to have transformed from a mark of assault into a badge of honor, testament to the triumph of duty over entitlement. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Windsor Castle's ancient courtyard, as normalcy slowly returned to the historic grounds. The guard's uniform, though bearing the evidence of Victoria's assault, seemed to gleam with renewed dignity in the fading light. Each water stain and chemical mark had transformed from a symbol of attack into a badge of honor, telling its own story of unwavering discipline in the face of ignorance. By evening, the video had gone viral across every major social media platform. Dar's Windsor Guardian and Dar's Steel Gaze were trending worldwide, with millions sharing clips of the extraordinary moment when corporate entitlement met military discipline. But beneath the viral sensation lay a deeper story about the nature of true authority and the power of unwavering dedication. Victoria Blackwood's carefully constructed world had crumbled in spectacular fashion. Her corporate email had already begun filling with urgent messages from board members and PR teams scrambling to distance themselves from the incident. The military-grade pepper spray, illegally imported and recklessly deployed, had transformed her from global director of executive relations to defendant in a matter of hours. News outlets picked up the story, their headlines capturing the irony of a corporate crisis manager creating her own spectacular crisis. Queen's Guard stands firm. Corporate executives' attack backfires, read one. Steel Gaze, military discipline defeats designer pepper spray, declared another. Each report emphasized the stark contrast between artificial authority and genuine strength of character. The retired Canadian officer's words continued to echo through social media discussions. In 30 years of service, I've never seen such extraordinary discipline. His impromptu testimony had added crucial context to the incident, helping viewers understand the true magnitude of the Guard's response. Military veterans from around the world chimed in, sharing their own experiences with pepper spray training and commending the Guard's unwavering composure. But perhaps the most profound impact came from the Guard's own words, now being quoted across platforms and news reports. I pity anyone who sees a soldier standing guard and thinks victim, who mistakes discipline for weakness. His response had transformed a potential scandal into a powerful lesson about the nature of true strength and service. The incident sparked broader discussions about the contrast between genuine authority and entitled behavior. Corporate training videos began incorporating the footage as a case study in how not to handle confrontations. Military academies noted the Guard's response as an example of discipline under unexpected civilian attack. Victoria's social media empire imploded spectacularly. Her carefully curated Instagram feed, once filled with power poses and luxury lifestyle shots, became a battleground of public criticism. Her 50,000 followers watched in real time as her carefully constructed image of corporate authority crumbled in the face of genuine strength. Security experts analyzed the incident, noting how the Guard's training had prepared him for far worse than civilian-grade pepper spray. His combat experience in Afghanistan and other conflict zones had built a resilience that no amount of corporate aggression could breach. The very medals Victoria had dismissed as costume jewelry told stories of battlefield courage that made her attack seem particularly pitiful in comparison. As the sun set over Windsor Castle, casting its final rays across the ancient stones, the Guard maintained his vigilant watch. His eyes, though still bearing traces of the morning's assault, remained fixed on that distant point, the memorial to fallen comrades that Victoria had so catastrophically failed to understand. Each passing tourist now viewed him with newfound respect, understanding that beneath the ceremonial uniform stood a combat-tested soldier whose discipline had transformed a moment of conflict into a lesson in dignity. The questions lingered in conversations around the world. What does this incident teach us about the nature of true authority? Is it found in designer labels and corporate titles, or in the quiet strength of unwavering dedication to duty? How does genuine discipline compare to the artificial power of social media influence and corporate position? Perhaps the most powerful lesson came from what didn't happen, how the Guard's restraint and discipline proved far more impactful than any aggressive response could have been. His steady gaze and measured words had done more damage to Victoria's artificial authority than any physical reaction ever could. In the end, the incident became more than just another viral video. It served as a reminder that true strength often speaks most loudly through silence, that genuine authority needs no artificial amplification, and that the power to stand unmoved in the face of adversity represents a kind of strength that no corporate title can confer. As the evening shadows lengthened across Windsor Castle's grounds, the Guard's unwavering stance continued to embody centuries of military tradition and discipline. Each tourist who passed, each photo taken, each story shared, carried forward a powerful message about the difference between those who demand respect and those who truly earn it. The guard's final words to Victoria echoed across social media. "You came here looking for attention, trying to prove some point about power and authority. Instead, you've demonstrated exactly why we stand guard, to protect a society that allows even people like you to enjoy freedoms you clearly don't appreciate." In those words lay perhaps the most profound lesson of all, that true service often means protecting even those who fail to understand its value. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.